We've seen in the first part of this presentation on modern ethical systems that while the Machiavellian approach served the needs of the prince and perhaps gave a very effective moral system and ethic for a political or perhaps even a business leader, it did have its downsides. And similar with the Enlightenment approach of David Hume. Moral sentiment theory, one way or another, is useful because you can rely on your own conscience, to use the term which is probably most familiar or was familiar in Christian ethos. You can use your feelings to get a bit of an idea of where you're going, so it is useful. But the fact that some people's moral or ethical feelings lead them into some pretty dastardly activities tells us that it's not everything there is. And so in the end, these early modern systems from the 16th century and the 18th century were not so reliable. We now move to the next thinker that we're going to consider, Immanuel Kant. Kant was living roughly at the end of the 18th century. He's not, well, he is an Enlightenment thinker or not. He really aimed to correct the excesses of Hume, the naivety and the extremism of moral sentiment theory and the idea of this hard belief in empiricism. In 1785, he wrote The Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals, and in that he argued for what he called his categorical imperative, a very powerful sounding term, the categorical imperative. And in the metaphysics, or the grounding for the metaphysics of morals, the categorical imperative is stated a number of times through the work in slightly different terms. Here is one example of it. Act only according to that maxim, that principle, if you like, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And so, while Immanuel Kant is rejecting the idea of objective universal laws that somehow exist externally in reality, he said you can work out what they should be. If they existed, what would they be? And you can work them out by working out what principle would give you a reasonable social result. And so you can't have everybody eating everybody else because you wouldn't have a society. So that wouldn't work as a universal law. Telling the truth might be a contender for becoming a universal law. When you look closely at telling the truth, you might have some wrinkles on it as to when it is necessary and when it's not. And Kant would say, you work that out by asking yourself the question, what would happen if everyone did that? What would happen if people didn't tell the truth? And from that, you can deduce whether truth-telling or the various situations of truth-telling would be robust or not as a potential universal law. And from that, and two other ideas, Kant concluded that we could build a moral system, an ethical system. His approach really comes from a preoccupation with what he refers to as duty. We know it today as deontology, and any ethical system which derives its force from some sense of duty, some appeal to duty, is called a deontological approach to morals. It is, if you like, relying on the existence of these universal laws that everybody must have. When you think about it, any moral system that's going to be effective for a society must be something that the society as a whole is going to adopt, because there's no point in having one value for me, one value for you, and so on. That's not really a society, because I won't be able to trust what you're going to be doing. It needs to be something which is bigger than the individual and hopefully more permanent. And so being willing to submit to duty is an important part of this idea of making, a universal work. Kant also appealed to the principle to help you make these calculations, which was the dignity of humanity. We've seen that before, that because humans all have some importance and the importance is equal, then that gives us a bit of a prompt as to what we can invent as our potential universals. Notice that Kant is not saying that they are universals or that they would become a universal, but merely that when you and I decide that a particular maxim is potentially a universal, that's about as far as we can go, and we kind of hope that everybody else will share in our determination. In this way, it's a bit like Hume, in that it is worked on my ideas, your ideas, and there's no absolute ideas, there's simply my truth, your truth, and so on. But at least we're aiming at sort of fudging what should be universal. So it's kind of got one foot in each camp. It sounds like a strategy for identifying universals, and so that is satisfying to the, let's say, the naive realist in us. However, when we look closer, because what we're really saying is that by you and I determining to ourselves that such and such would make a good universal law, what we're really doing is saying that I'm going to act God here. I'm going to say what should be universally applicable. I'm going to make myself the Almighty One, the All-Knowing One, and the one who is infallible. And I have the power to decide what rates as a universal. And if you have a different idea to what a universal should be, then bad luck. And so there's going to be a certain amount of conflict that's going to come out of this. And this is pretty much what happens with Kantian approach. Kant's approach, by the way, is very popular amongst people who, for other reasons, have chosen the modern position, the idea that nothing exists outside of what can be apprehended through the senses. Because at least it does give us an intellectual procedure for accessing something which is potentially bigger and more permanent than ourselves. And we're still assuming, a bit like Hume, that we're all going to come up with the same results. If we all sit down soberly and disinterestedly, we will all end up with the same set of universals, and so by some kind of consensus we will end up with agreement, and that would be lovely. The only problem is that it doesn't always happen. Let's look at an example. I would like to suggest what I'm going to call Small's contender for a universal law. I'll call it number 607 because I've done a lot of this before. Academics deserve a perpetual percentage of their students' future income. Now, I think that would be a marvellous universal law, and in fact, I think it could be applied right across the West and maybe globally. I don't see any downsides with it. After all, my students are going to be able to earn their fancy professional incomes as a result of what I've taught them. And, maybe if I take some modest percentage, let's say 2% of your future revenues, your future salaries, whatever, wouldn't hurt much from your point of view. And it would respect the value of the learning that I've given you. And so that would be quite reasonable. To a certain extent, we already do this with things like copyrights and other IP sort of issues where we take royalties and so on, don't we? So I assert that if I was, a Hollywood movie company, I could possibly phrase it in a slightly different way and take a perpetual percentage of my actors' future incomes, or my box office of future incomes, or your future enjoyment, whatever it is. Okay, and so we can see that does. Now, from your point of view, though, let's look at it from the other side. I'm going to take 2% of your future income. Through this course, you might find yourself with maybe a dozen lecturers. So that means that dozen times 2, that means 24% of your income from doing your course, thereabouts. 2% here, 2% there. It's not very much for anyone particular. You'll probably start to lose interest in it as a universal law. I still like it as a universal law, but you might start to feel a little bit uncomfortable with that, especially when we add maybe your teachers from school, because after all, they've helped to prepare you for your future professional careers. You've had 12 years of schooling. Let's say that's another dozen teachers through high school. You actually probably have more than that, so it might be about 20. So if they're taking 2% each, that's another 40% of your income gone. That's okay, though, because after all those teachers have contributed to your income earning ability. So now between your university and your high school, you're contributing something like about 50-something% of your income to your education. I think that's quite reasonable as universal law. I think you can see the point here, though. What suits me as a wonderful idea for universal law may not suit everybody. And maybe my determination might be because of a particular perspective I bring to the table. Okay? If I wasn't the teacher, but rather the person being taught, I might have a very different determination. And this is pretty much what we see across the board. And so the question then is, well, who actually gets to choose? Who gets to play God and make the potentially universal principles, maxims? We don't know. In practice, it's more likely those people who have some degree of power in the community. The economically powerful, the politically powerful, the media savvy. That's what tends to happen. In professional relationships, especially the professions related to finance. Often it's the professional, the consultant, who has the power. And so questions like professional remuneration come up with some very interesting possibilities when we apply Kant's deontological categorical imperative. However, the idea of asking that question, what would happen if everyone does it, as a approximate starting point for moral reflection is not a bad one. It does give us a good point in the right direction. So Kant's categorical imperative remains as a very popular moral system, and in many cases it's a very useful moral system. But because it does allow the moral actor, the person deciding to act, it gives them the power to decide on what's the universal, the power to act as God. It can have its downsides, and so we have to be a bit cautious of it. And so while we can analyse ethical puzzles from a deontological Kantian viewpoint, it's also important to appreciate that Kant's disciples can get it wrong. Another aspect about this is that one way or another it sort of fudges in a kind of quasi-metaphysics. It really is giving some form of existence to these potential universals. And that has some curious implications. We don't have time to go into them too far now, but I do invite you to spend a little bit of time reflecting on the odd things that can happen from applying Kant, even though it's very often a very useful system. And become familiar with the maxim, the categorical imperative, because that will be very useful when you talk about Kant and applying the Kantian system. This leads us to the Utilitarians. We're going to start off by looking at Jeremy Bentham, and to a certain extent a disciple of Bentham, another Englishman, both Englishmen, John Stuart Mill. Bentham really, his life overlapped Kant's, and John Stuart Mill was influenced heavily by Bentham. Bentham was a close friend of Mill's father. Bentham was a hardcore materialist. He believed that the only things that existed were the things you could see and touch and feel and so on. And so from that, and a bit of Humean thinking, he concluded that the only good things, the only meaning of good, the only possible meaning for good, would be something material. If only the only things that exist are material, then the only things that can have as your object are material as well. And so he would say that good things bring material pleasure, bad things bring pain. And he said, well, that's all obvious. We can measure those scientifically. And we can measure them and just work out how we get the best balance of good versus bad, benefit versus cost. And we do that in financial and economic analysis, cost-benefit analysis and so on. And that gives us this utilitarian notion. And Bentham said, well, if all we are is just the flesh and blood and so on, then this moral question is really easy. We simply opt for society, what is, if you like, what the individual does, only on a social scale. If the individual goes for the greatest pleasures and the least pain, then if we do that calculation for everybody and just work out what the optimum number is, the maximising of pleasure over pain, then that is the moral objective. So all ethical systems are simply systems that give us the greatest good for the greatest number. And it means that ethics can be measured scientifically by utility outcomes. John Stuart Mill added the extra dimension of intellectual things, the intellectual pleasure of solving some complex mathematical equation or something, or maybe the intellectual pleasure, the whatever pleasure you get from looking at a beautiful painting or something. And so, as well as straight material pleasures, humans are able to do a little tiny bit more. And so you still have this idea, though, that even the intellectual pleasures are able to be measured by this utility calculation. And so utilitarianism has the appearance of being objective. It is not a matter of feelings, the way that Hume so naively put it. It's not left to the individual to decide and play God the way that Kant attempted. It's rather something that you can measure. So it's science. It really is turning ethics into something similar to physics or chemistry or astronomy or something. And so that has considerable attraction, especially those who consider that they want everything to be scientific. Where science is not certain knowledge through cause, but it is, reliable knowledge through observation, and especially under the direction, under the reference of mathematics. So it suits a materialist world largely, the utilitarian approach, and it's very, very important because utilitarianism has been adopted as the foundation, the moral grounding for economics. And when you go to your first class in economics, as some of you would have experienced already, you learn that the object of economics is to maximize utility. And you talk about the economic actor as a utility maximizing rational individual. And so while modern economics claims to be positive, it's about as positive as utilitarianism. And it certainly still needs utilitarianism to actually get itself off the ground. So it has never really escaped being a subset of moral philosophy. It's also used, utilitarianism is also used in political arguments to justify various policies. And we'll look at a couple of examples of that as we go along. So it was developed roughly 1.5, almost 2 centuries ago. It has proven very popular in democratic political thinking and modern economic thinking. And so utilitarianism is a force to be reckoned with. And it has this appearance of giving us an objective, scientifically measurable solution to the moral problem, the ethical problem. And so it appears to have considerable elegance. The wheels start to fall off, as they did when Irving Fisher, the economist, roughly about a century ago, a little bit less, started to try to work out the theory of interest, a very interesting moral problem that exists in the economic world, the theory of interest. Why is the charge of interest on a money loan moral or immoral? And as part of the determination, Fisher noticed that you can't actually measure utility. Economists say you can, of course, but you can measure money and you can measure what people say is the money equivalent, which we call price conventionally. And we can say, well, price must be the utility of the good being bought or sold. Now, that's really a big topic, and a topic for perhaps another day or maybe even a separate class. Suffice to say that the relationship between utility and price, the more people look at it, the more difficult it becomes. In the 1920s, there was a fair bit of debate in the American Economic Society, and basically they concluded that no, you can't do it. That utility and price are two very, very different things. They sometimes move together, but they also sometimes don't. And so you can't make that simple conclusion. What Fisher did was say, well, the pleasure I derive, to use a Bentham concept, the pleasure I derive from owning something or enjoying its consumption is quite a separate thing to the money value that I put onto it. Fisher would say that the money value of a thing, a fine bottle of wine or what have you, is a proxy, a substitute, a kind of token representative or something of the utility. But the relationship between that token and the reality is something quite vague and variable. I might decide to pay a lot for a bottle of wine if I'm trying to impress a client whose work I'm looking for, or maybe a woman that I want to court. But on another day, there might be no way that I'd pay $200 for a bottle of wine over dinner. You can't make this simple equation of how much utility, and you can create arguments to solve all of those problems perhaps, but are they real arguments, or are they simply ways of justifying what is, in many practical common sense ways, just some of the absurdities of the foibles of human nature? Fisher recognised it, and we've been kind of arguing over ever since. Although, because it makes it a lot harder to do economics, in fact, a lot harder to do utilitarianism, we tend to ignore what Fisher discovered and blind Freddy sort of knows about without having to go to university. However, we continue. Utilitarianism is quite useful. There is a kind of concept, if you like, or a usefulness of it, like these other systems, that it does give us a general idea. For instance, if we're considering a new tax regime, for instance, if it does make most of the people in the community a little bit happier, then it will create the greatest good for the greatest number. We have a lot of practical problems because when we try and calculate it, if we're trying to do some sort of a mean or something, do we add the utility benefits, the happiness values, the pleasure increases across the community, and then divide by the number of communities, number of people in the community? We do that when we do things like gross domestic product per capita, GDP per capita, very important statistic in economics. Well, GDP per capita sometimes can hide some really bizarre things. For instance, you can have a very happy, comfortable, prosperous community of relatively modest GDP per capita, where you have a situation where, most people have a, range of shares of that, which is sort of moderately equitable. Or you could have another situation where 99.99999% of the community is in abject poverty and dire misery, but one person claims, because they happen to own all of the wealth in the community, we might call them the king or some tyrant or something, that the excessive delights that they have from being so fabulously wealthy is actually even more pleasure than all of the other people put together. And so in that weird situation, you can still have the greatest good for the greatest number being realised by something which could be causing an awful lot of people an awful lot of misery. When we apply it to particular examples, we'll consider maybe bank robbers or insurance fraud. A bank robber will maximise his own utility. He might be of the opinion that the various depositors aren't really losing a great deal, so they're not really suffering a disutility to any extent, and so they might go ahead. In insurance fraud, it's probably even more pronounced, because I might decide to burn down my own house or run my own car off a cliff or something to claim on insurance for whatever reason. And I might think to myself, well, my pleasure will be increased marvellously by getting the car paid off. I might have not liked the colour of it or something. So my utility has gone up, and all of those other people who are paying premiums into that insurance company, their insurance premium might go up by some, sort of fraction of a percentage of 1 cent per year or something, and so they won't even notice it. So my insurance fraud might not really cause them any noticeable harm, and so my positive utility is substantial. Their negative utility is infinitesimally, insignificant. And so utilitarianism would say, well, bank robbers will go for it. Just make sure they don't get caught. And the bank robber has the advantage, he can appeal to Hume and say, well, I feel like robbing banks. And Jeremy Bentham has told me that it's okay because, really I'm increasing the good, the collective pleasure, because I happen to feel really, really good being a millionaire now, or whatever it is that they come away with. Utilitarianism reminds us that ethics needs something external and fixed, rather than something which is always pragmatic and always following on the individual's determination at a particular point in time. And we can see the difficulty in calculating utility that we've already considered to a certain extent. There are lots of places where the utility calculation and the practicalities of the utility calculation start to reveal that there are a number of holes in it. At its very least, the greatest good for the greatest number means that there's absolutely nothing which is actually counted out of being potentially acceptable. And so maybe murdering people we don't like by putting them into an arena and letting them get eaten by lions for everybody else's enjoyment, you might say, well, there's only a handful of dudes down there getting eaten alive, whereas there might be 100,000 people in the arena looking down and having a merry old time of it. And by the time we add together the pleasure of the spectators, subtract from it the inconvenience to the entertainment, people being eaten, it actually gives us a really positive benefit-cost ratio, and so it's quite reasonable. So human sacrifice becomes reasonable, slavery becomes reasonable, lots of bizarre things. Part of that is because of the problems with measuring utility. And we come back to the similar question that seems to haunt modernity, and that is, who decides on your utility? Who decides? Who is the person who plays the moral God? Is it those in power, the politicians? In a sense, we believe that because we, in a democracy, vote for people that we're going to give the power to make utilitarian decisions. We kind of hope they represent us. Curious thing is that in democracies like Australia or the United States or many other countries, the people that have the power to do that usually are holding on by a margin which is only a few percent. So there are almost as many people disagreeing with those making these decisions as there are people making the decisions. So you wonder how clear-cut it is. And if we stay with party politics, and you do see it to a certain extent, the utilitarians on the one side of Parliament, when they get in, will pass laws that they believe give you the greatest good for the greatest number, while 45% of the electorate think, well, that's really dreadful, I hate this. And 3 years later, it's simply swapped over and there's a different set of policy initiatives kind of coming in under the same argument, again, with almost half the population disagreeing. Now, one of the curious examples of this is where you put things like airports. If you are I don't like talking about left and right, but let's say red and green. You know, we'll give the alternatives for politics as red and green. If there's a safe red electorate and the Greens happen to be in power, and they know they'll never get a candidate in the red electorate, the Greens might do something like set up a nuclear waste dump in the middle of the red electorate. It doesn't really hurt them because they know that it's got to go somewhere. It's not going to hurt. People are going to vote for them, so they know they'll get in the next election. The Reds weren't going to vote for them anyway, and so who cares? We see this with the location of various public utilities, not necessarily nuclear waste dumps, but certainly airports. And we can look to Sydney or a number of other places around the world to see how the airport's location or the threat of them is very often decided by those in power for political purposes more than utility, unless you subscribe to public choice theory, which is a curious branch of economics that you can bring to bear on political decisions. We don't have time to go into that here. The other problem with utility calculus is that our ability, our human ability, our psychological ability to calculate and relate utilities tends to fail when we're trying to compare utilities across distance, across time, and unfortunately across ethnicity. What this means is that with distance, I tend to be more concerned about the events coming close to me, and so the nuclear power dump, I will value the effect of it very significantly if it happens to be going to be done next door to me, as opposed to next door to the people on the other side of town. The further the distance is, the less it worries me. If I hear about some calamity where 1,000 people die, if it happens in the middle of Africa or what have you, I tend to consider the utility, that the impact on my life and the likelihood of me maybe making a donation to help those people, considerably different to if maybe 10 people die in my suburb. And again, we reach into our pockets in proportion to how important we see things happen, and things that are happening close to us tend to attract the greatest amount of support or concern. Likewise with time, and most are familiar with the way that, if I want to diet, I'm comparing the utility of having lost a few pounds in maybe 6 or 12 or months' time, or 2 or 3 years' time, with the disutility of not being able to eat the yummy things this morning, or with my morning tea or something. Time has a very powerful effect on moderating our estimation of utility. Ethnicity speaks for itself, especially in a tribal world, and it's very hard for humans to get out of a tribal mentality completely. People of a different ethnicity, very often their sufferings are ignored while our pleasures are taken for granted. And so it has given rise to a lot of very poor ethical decisions based on utilitarianism because of a misunderstanding of the utility of the poor victims of the policies that we might feel totally comfortable with. So slavery is a good example historically. We'll look at a case study to drive this home. We'll talk about what I'll call academic symbiosis. Students derive great utility from getting a good pass. And so if you express that in money terms, a student might consider it very attractive to pay $100 for a pass and not have to do the assignment, the exam or something. and maybe $200 or for a distinction, or maybe $500 or whatever, and that would save them a lot of bother. On the other hand, academics, are considered to be relatively poor in the community, certainly compared to self-employed sort of professionals, and they would derive great utility from some extra income. Now, it looks like using a purely utilitarian approach, there's the opportunity here to derive a great increase in the greatest good for the greatest number, because we can increase the utility for the students by letting them pay for their passes. And so for $100, they saved an awful lot of bother, so their good has improved considerably. And when all of that is concentrated into the pockets of the academics, then the academics are also experiencing substantial positive utility. And so it's a positive plus a positive, so it's a utilitarian no-brainer. However, I don't want any of you to think I'm being serious here, because both of us would end up in an awful lot of bother. And it illustrates how poor utilitarianism is for many particular cases. And it becomes almost a parlour game, applying utilitarian ethic to practical cases of gravely improper practice. And I invite you to give some thought to examples of that in your own professional lives or your personal lives. I'll give you a second case study, improving community happiness. We all know that some people are depressed and miserable and they prefer to be dead. Maybe some of us have felt that way from time to time. As a responsible government, therefore, what we could say, in order to increase the average happiness across the community, what we could do is offer, maybe insist, on a painless cull of the 10% most depressed people in the community. And by doing that, the average of the community will be a lot better off. We'll have less problems with overpopulation, and we'll have a happier community. Where's the downside? There's no pain being involved. There's only pleasure. We're eliminating displeasure. And so simply reducing the population by 10%, taking out the depressed people, we have achieved a marvellous improvement, almost a painless improvement, in the overall enjoyment of life expressed by the community. And if it works by doing something like the 10% cull today, we might say, well, that's been really successful, let's do it again. So let's do it on next month. We might have first of the month as greatest good for the greatest number day, where we just invite or maybe push the most depressed people into a little box somewhere and press the button. And it should be fairly obvious that you can't do that very far without causing huge problems. In fact, you can't really do it at all, despite the fact that it comes through a utilitarian analysis with flying colours. So we can see that utilitarianism, despite its popularity, and as I say, it's probably the most important moral system at the moment, despite its popularity, maybe we've taken some absurd examples, but really they're not that far from the realms of reality. And even if we take more realistic and more modest questions which are in our community, we can see that they, if they're taken to their logical conclusions, come up with something very, very sinister instead of what we're expecting. Now, let's look at the logic of contemporary morals. We've asked the question a number of times. We've noticed that the question comes down to the question of who decides, whether it's Machiavelli's Prince, the feelings of the bank robber for Hume, whoever it is who's able to determine the categorical imperative for Kant, The person who chooses to make the utilitarian decisions, who decides? That's a big question. Why? Because there aren't any objective reference points to any of these moral systems. And so it does come down to a question of who has the power to decide. The 20th century thinker Foucault noted that and came to a fairly obvious conclusion, that is that relationship is power. If these things are all attempts at understanding the appropriate way for humans to relate to each other, and it all comes down to who is in the driving seat, then society is all about power and really is about very little apart from power. A rather dismal conclusion, but one that, if you accept the premises of the argument, is relatively hard to avoid. Foucault is associated with postmodernity, postmodern thinking, and so on. A regrettably depressive approach to life, but one which is now becoming extremely popular. Maybe not expressed in those terms, but I think most of us have probably heard the claim, the cry, if you like, that everything is about power. Now, if everything is about power, then we have a fairly bleak future, because all of the weird and bizarre possibilities that we've looked at in the case studies through these presentations becomes possible. Foucault was not the first person to make this observation. In fact, he comes at the end of a tradition that really started at the beginning of the 19th century. Started with a philosopher known as Hegel, who lived about the same time as Kant, or Bentham, in that kind of, the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th centuries. Hegel developed his thinking, his philosophy, his view of the world from a kind of strange philosophical, theological speculation, I guess is all we could call it, that all had to do with the nature of God, peculiar enough. Hegel was of the opinion that God was, before creation sort of happened, he was there, the only thing in existence, and because there was the only thing in existence, he didn't have anyone to talk to, and because he didn't have anyone to talk to, he didn't really understand very much about what he was like, and so all of creation happened as a result of God deciding to make himself what is effectively a big mirror. And so God took part of himself and made the created universe out of it, and then used history as a progressive tutorial in getting to know himself. So creation is, in some ways, God's way of getting to know himself. You don't have to worry about the theology of it. It's pretty weird. However, the importance of Hegel is that Hegelian thinking has had an extraordinary influence on our understanding of society, especially through various branches of the modern science of sociology. It's also the intellectual foundation, the absolute bedrock of important attitudes which are forming our society, principally feminism, but also other movements as well. A lot of those have come through an intermediary who was a disciple of Hegel, Karl Marx. Marx, for most of us, would be associated with being the father of communism. However, Marx is more correctly identified as a social thinker, a person who had a social idea, not necessarily an economic idea. And so in sociology, Marx is considered to be a sociologist, not an economist, which comes as a bit of a surprise for people with an economic or a financial background. The reason that Marx is associated with economics is that his social theory, his sociology, if you like, is based on the belief, in Marx expressed as an intermediate conclusion, that economics is the fundamental institution upon which all society rests. And Marx would say that all other institutions in society, the institution of the family, religion, government, politics, media, all of them, all serve the economy. Marx was a materialist. He believed that all that existed was what you could see and touch and feel and so on. And in that world, like Bentham, he said, well, the only things that can have value are things that have economic value. So he went off and said, well, the whole purpose of ethics, or anything else for that matter, the family, whatever, education, all of those, education, family, ethics, is for the subjugation of the weak. And weak and strong is determined in purely economic ways. And so we have communism coming out of the conclusion of Marx's thinking. And Marx was applying Hegel in a particular way. In sociology, Marx is associated with an approach to society which is called conflict theory. And you can see that coming from Hegel, this idea that if God is using the other person to get to know himself, he's basically in a permanent competition. Slightly more aggressive form of competition is conflict. If I want to work out who's stronger, you or me, I might get into a fight with you just to be able to prove to myself and to you that I'm bigger and stronger. And from Hegel and from Marx, you get this idea that every relationship, an educator and his student, a husband and a wife, a political leader and the governed, a business owner and his employees, a merchant and his customers, every relationship is based on competition and conflict, dysfunctional competition, I guess we could say. That is a kind of an unraveling of ethical thinking. Marx certainly wasn't proposing any ethic when he wrote the Capital or his Communist Manifesto. It reeks of principles for appropriate relations between humans, but Marx is not talking about ethics at all. Hegel, hardly. Foucault, well, if you're interpreting all relationships as power relations, there's hardly a notion of justice in there. And that's pretty much where we get to. We can move into the attempts at moral philosophy through the 20th century. And there are really three of them. They're attempts to retrieve something from really what Hegel and Marx left us with. The three are intuitionism, that's early 20th century, emotivism, and prescriptivism. Intuitionism is the idea, the belief, that moral values proceed from intuitions, which is really a slightly different form of Hume's moral sentiment theory. We have this intuition, this kind of belief that sort of sometimes comes out like an instinct. Instinct perhaps really is only substituted instinct or intuition for sense or sensation. Slightly different, but effectively not very much. That was overtaken by emotivism. Emotivism is about getting motivation happening. And that would say that a moral value, a moral statement, is nothing more than a directive statement. It is a form of communication. It's a form of sentence, if you like, which is aimed at causing the hearer to act for some reason in conformity with the intentions of the utterer, the person giving the instruction. And so it totally empties moral thought of any real substance or logic. It simply says, if I say, thou shalt not kill, or you aren't permitted to drive on the wrong side of the road, it doesn't mean you're good or bad, or that I'm saying anything about goodness or badness or anything. I'm simply telling you what I want you to do, and if you're silly enough to believe me, then that becomes a moral value. That's emotivism. It's pretty sparse. Then you have prescriptivism. Prescriptivism is a kind of advanced pragmatism, in that it's the conclusion that a moral statement is simply a way of predicting what will happen if you don't follow it. You can see a little bit of Kantian categorical imperative kind of lurking in there, that if I say thou shalt not kill, I'm really saying that if people were killing each other, then bad things would happen. or if people were stealing from each other, bad things would happen. There'd be some bad thing that would sort of happen in the future. So I'm kind of predicting the future, and I'm saying I don't really care whether something is right or wrong. I simply want a future of a particular type, and my pragmatic way to do it is to make these moral statements which kind of head off your likelihood of doing something which I believe will cause a future downside. And you see a certain amount of prescriptivism in all moral debate, all moral discourse, and to a certain extent in the moral thinking. Even healthy moral thinking has a certain amount of prescriptivism in it, but it's a matter of whether the prescriptive element is the crux of the argument or simply something else, just an aside, a tangent, a hanger-on to the real content of the moral discourse, the moral determination. So we're in a difficult position. Of course, Foucault is here at the end of the 20th century as well. So we can see that he kind of fits in as another, if you like, more of a critique, if you like, than actual positive contribution. Another way of looking at this is to look at alternatives to ethics. Emile Durkheim, who was very much a 19th century thinker, died in 1917. He looked around his Europe that he loved dearly and concluded that moral philosophy had failed during his life, or maybe before. He could see that it simply wasn't working. People weren't taking it seriously. And so he said, well, we need something else. We need a new way to understand appropriate principles for action. He looked around and thought, well, we need a scientific approach, and a lot of people have been saying that now for, some centuries. So his solution was the new positive science of sociology. Emile Durkheim is one of the three founders of the modern science of sociology. Durkheim is one of the founders, Marx is the second, and Weber. We're not doing sociology here, but suffice to say, both Durkheim and Marx are really contributing ethical thinking, but hiding it under a completely different science. And so when we do sociology, we don't think we're doing morals, but really sociology largely can be interpreted as an alternate way of getting to conclusions about appropriate relations between persons. In a different way, modern psychology is an alternative to ethics, because the psychological dysfunctional person is somebody who is noted for inappropriate behavior. And so the psychologist would say, well, we think your behavior is not appropriate, therefore we'll send you to a mental institution where we will reprogram you so that you behave like the rest of us, and everyone will be happy. Well, what's appropriate and inappropriate when it comes to behavior? Isn't that an alternate definition for moral principles? Well, it is. And we see this especially when we look at some particular systems of psychology, especially in the clinical area. Currently, cognitive behavior therapy is amongst the more popular methods being used, and CBT for short is where the clinical psychologist will sit the patient down and simply talk through with them and explain, if you like, get the patient to understand the inappropriateness of their behavior. And they might be a serial rapist or something, and using CBT, you kind of get the patient to discover that being a serial abuser or what have you is not a very good and healthy thing, and they change their ways, and then they're considered to be psychologically readjusted to normality. What you're really saying is that we're doing moral education through CBT, but we're cloaking it in the guise of healthy or unhealthy psychology. The third alternative that we're finding, coming pretty much through the 20th century, but sort of starting in some cases a bit earlier, modern anthropology. This is particularly evident in some areas of human activity. I would say particularly evident in the area of sexuality. And probably the best example there would be Margaret Mead. But there are others, Kinsey, for example, as well, who are exploring what the human person is like. The anthropologist tends to look at other cultures and does field studies and so on. Margaret Mead looked at the Samoan Islanders and concluded that they were very free and easy when it came to sexual relations. And as a result of that, Margaret Mead became pretty much the intellectual sort of foundation for the sexual revolution of the 1960s and so on. The only problem with Mead's anthropology was that another anthropologist, Derek Friedman, a New Zealander, went back some years later and spoke to the same people that Margaret Mead interviewed. They were somewhat older at the time, and discovered that Margaret Mead's sort of teenagers or young adults, who she discovered were so sexually free and easy, in fact, weren't anything like that. They thought that Mead's questioning was so extraordinarily bad manners, they played a joke on her and told her all sorts of stories that they just made up on the spot. It wasn't true at all. That has caused a very interesting controversy, which is still to a certain extent rattling along, largely because our culture now is so comfortable with Mead's conclusions that they really don't want to accept Freeman's observations that they're all based on air. So it's a bit of a scientific fiasco. It's still very much a debate which is going on, but the hard science is not hard to get to. The important thing for us, though, is that we have these three new sciences: the modern science of sociology, the modern science of psychology, and the modern science of anthropology, all with a major component which is effectively aiming to provide a different solution to the moral question of asking what are the principles for appropriate relations between persons. The last thing we can look at as we waltz through the various possibilities is to look at other people who are walking the earth today that follow a very different approach to modern values, mainly tribal people, customary people today, and their different approach. And if you find people that still follow traditional values, whether they come from the Pacific Islands or New Guinea or Africa or various other parts of the world, we find that their approach to ethics is far more community or family focused. For tribal people, most of them, it is grounded on tradition of stories that go back to their creation stories, so it's based on their spirituality. They would say that the facts of the existence of the earth, talk to Aboriginal people, they'll look at a hill or a river or what have you and say, well, that's there, isn't it? It can't have made itself. There must be some spirit that created it, and we know that spirit because our traditions tell us that that spirit gave that mountain and that river to us, and it also told us how to live our lives, gave us our laws and customs, which is really our ethical system. And so for tribal people, usually their ethics are grounded in some form of spirituality. And because it's coming from outside, coming from the spirits or coming from the nature of existence, the same forces that made the mountains and the rivers also set the ethics in place. Ethics are bigger and more stable than the moral actor. And for Indigenous people, this means that there can exist amongst them a very high level of trust, at least within their own tribes. Between tribes, they might fight and maybe eat each other, but within their own tribes, they have a reference point which is very stable, very external, and so it makes for a very solid community. And this sense of community is very, very important amongst tribal people. Ultimately, that means that tribal people, non-Western people, are based on a different anthropology. By anthropology, I mean here the theory of what it is to be human. Sociologists have looked at this, especially the sociologist Tonnies, who gave us two terms to describe two different possibilities for society. Tonnies gave us two German words. He said that a society can be thought of as a community, which is very much what the tribal people perceive it as, and he called that a Gemeinschaft society, a society that is organic like a family, where the people have a strong sense of obligation to the society and to each other, and they act for the good of the other, and they're very active in thinking along those lines. Usually their ethics, their moral principles are very fixed and stable over time and very reliable, and those communities tend to act in solidarity. Tönnies contrasted that to societies that he described as Gesellschaft societies, which are more like an association. And we've already spoken about the association theory of society, which is very much what you see all through modernity. Modernity flourished as the Gemeinschaft attitudes of the Middle Ages and the High Medieval period gave way to the individualism, the association orientation of modernity. And this individualist approach is something which has come through to the present. And so for Tönnies, he would say that tribal people have a completely different ethical approach to moderns. The moderns tend to have a very different philosophical approach, moral approach, what have you, to the pre-moderns, so the medieval era, grounded as it was in Christianity, has probably more in common with tribal people than it does with modernity, a fact which is rather curious. The important thing about the tribal people is that within the parameters of their laws and customs, you can speak rationally about them. And when you look at different tribes, since you're looking at different fixed sets of laws and customs, it is relatively easy to be able to make conclusions about their relative merits. Some are better and some are worse. This is an important aspect if we're going to be discussing morals, because unless we can say this principle is better than that principle, there's really no point in us talking at all. With that, we really get to the end of this tour through modern ethical systems, and this last slide looking at non-Western contemporary ethics, because they're very much alive and well in the world today, and they do provide a welcome comparison for contrast. What you can do is apply each one of these systems that we've gone through to particular questions to hopefully give you a bit of a point in the right direction. But you also need to be very wary of the downsides and ask yourself, if I've applied Kant or Hume or what have you to solving a particular moral question, is the result that I get from this particular moral system going to be robust? Where is it going to fall over? And we can apply that both to the modern systems, the tribal systems, or the moderate realist system that we've gone over in the preliminary classes, say that's sort of coming from Aristotle. And I think with that, we've just about gone through all of the possibilities for ethical determination.